So if you are drinking a lot of alcohol, but you lead a sedentary lifestyle and you have poor sleep habits, or, you live in a pretty stressful environment where you don't go to therapy, would be a good indicator of, increasing your risks for cancers. So I try and control those where I can, and I try and give people the same advice. Like, don't stop doing things that you enjoy just because they have risks associated with them. You have to live your life at the end of the day. But, there's only so much you really should worry about. And I think a lot of people miss the forest for the trees on that.
Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another episode of Better with Dr. Stephanie. It's me, your host, Dr. Stephanie Estima. And today we are talking all about cancer. My guest today is Dr. Joe Zundell. He received his PhD in cancer biology from the Wistar Institute at the University of the Sciences in Philadelphia. Throughout his 10 years performing lab work, Joe specializes in understanding the metabolic, epigenetic, and genetic contributions for cancers. Currently, he works within the private sector at a biotech company looking to advance targeted radiopharmaceuticals to better treat solid cancers. In his free time, he educates the public on social media about the complexities of cancer biology and how people can reduce their risk for developing cancers. And that is precisely what we talked about today. We talked about the genetic underpinnings, the metabolic underpinnings, current theories around cancer or the origins of cancer. We talk about the several hallmarks of cancer and how that is different from normal human cell biology. We talk about foods that can help reduce your risks, so specifically fiber and coffee, and there's a bunch of others. We talk about some of the common myths that Joe comes across in looking at cancer development and prognosis. And then, of course, we talk about some of the different specific cancers. So we talked about breast cancer, ovarian cancer, pancreatic cancer, and how those are all different from each other. Overall, this is a fantastic conversation. You are going to learn about some of the mechanistic targets. You're going to learn about some of it's pretty heavy science, but I know that you can handle it. We're going to have lots of show notes for you to help support you. There's lots of links to studies that were mentioned in our conversation. And I think this is going to be really, really valuable. So we talk about protein in cancer, fasting in cancer, caloric restriction in cancer, the Warburg effect, all the things that you might expect from a conversation on origin of cancer. And then, of course, what are some of the actionable items that we can do. And I'll give you a little Easter egg for you to listen all the way through to the end. At some point, there is a t-shirt that we are going to create together. So I'd love for you to find the Easter egg and tell me if you are going to make that t-shirt or we're going to make it together. We're going to make this cancer t-shirt, and hopefully you enjoy it as much as I had having it. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Joe Zundell. All right, Dr. Joe Zundell. I want to call you Joey, but we're going to go with Joe today. Welcome to the Better podcast.
Thanks for having me, Stephanie. I appreciate it.
I'm so happy that we're here today, and I'm excited to be talking today about cancer, which is your area or your field of expertise. This is something that we have somewhat explored on the show, but not really. I always wanted to have someone who is really deep in the research, who can speak to, and we're going to do a lot of this. We're going to talk around science and the nuance of cancer. I think that it can be very much oversimplified when we look at, we'll say, social media, influencers, take this goji berry or, fast for 80 hours or whatever. And that's going to cure your, without any context.
Right.
Of course, cancer is as a vague a term as human, because there's so many different permutations, presentations. So I'm really happy that you're here. So maybe what we'll do is I would love to start just with a basic definition of, your understanding of cancer. And if you're able to, we'll talk about the hallmarks of cancer, but I'd love for you to also talk about Hayflick's limit as well.
Oh,
so
sure.
Can we talk about cancer? What is cancer? And then we can kind of move into some of the hallmarks of what defines or sort of the unifying hallmarks that makes a cell cancerous.
Yeah, so I think there's a general consensus in the field of cancer biology that, in answering the question, what is cancer, most of us agree on the general consensus that cancer is a disease associated with continuous cell growth beyond what is considered normal. And so you mentioned Hayflick's limit. It's essentially the ability of cells to continue growing past what is Hayflick's limit. And Hayflick's limit, just for a simplified definition, is, cells have a certain amount of times that they can realistically divide and propagate and continue to make their genetic material. There's a limit to that, and that's what Hayflick's limit is. And typically, once they reach that limit, that's when the cells will either stop dividing and become senescent, which is typically associated with aging. So senescent means that they're, somewhat metabolically active, but not actively dividing. Or they'll be committed to a process called apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. It's a very calculated way that cells utilize specific mechanisms to kind of recycle some cellular components and die in a calculated fashion, so to speak.
Yeah. And so you've already named a couple of them. So, resisting cell death or resisting that cellular apoptosis, sustaining, and I've copied these from a paper. So just so the audience knows, I am no expert in cancer, but I've done some prep for this conversation to sound just somewhat,
it's somewhat
legible.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a lot. It's very complex. So
you don't need to tell me.
Yeah, I know, right? Sustaining proliferative signaling, so that ability to continue, so that's surpassing that Hayflick's limit that you were mentioning. Some of the other things, this is from a paper, and I'll put the link in the show notes. Evading growth suppressors. So there's another, when we think about normal cellular activity, you can't just grow and grow and grow without any boundaries. There's going to be some limits that the body, systemically, and then of course, at the organ level and at the cellular level, are going to put on your ability to, or on the cell's ability to grow and expand.
Yeah, there's actually, you're mentioning specifically the hallmarks of cancers, and there's actually 3 papers over the past, decade or so that have come out that build upon that. Initially, we had an agreement about specific characteristics that cancer cells share in terms of, continuing growing or reducing or preventing cell death. And we've gained a certain level of understanding about cancer cells that over time we've been able to add more hallmarks of cancer. But there's basically, I think 15 or 16 hallmarks of cancer, just based on what we've learned in the past, I guess over a decade now. Yeah.
All right. And then the other, just to touch on a few other ones, inducing angiogenesis. So being able to, direct blood flow and, vascularization and the nutrients that come with it to the cell or the dividing cell and the burgeoning tumor.
Yep.
Enabling, we've talked about this, replicative immortality,
right.
And then activating invasion and metastasis as well.
Yeah, and there's some others too. There's deregulating cellular metabolism, essentially, and that's, something that often people think of when they think of the Warburg effect. There's the variety of different metabolic pathways that are messed up in cancers that are on top of that as well. There's also, epigenetic reprogramming. There's also the association of polymorphic microbes, so the ability of microbes to shape tumor environments as well, that we've added over time as we've come to understand more about how microbes can impact some of those processes. There's also the ability of cancer cells to become immunosuppressive, so preventing our immune system from recognizing cancer cells, which is a pretty big component of our immune system in general in terms of keeping us healthy, not only recognizing tissue damage via, reducing cancer cell potential, but also preventing bacterial infections. So there's some overlap between the hallmarks, but we've got distinct things that we can tell apart from each other in terms of, examining a specific patient's tumor.
Well, it's interesting that you say polymorphic microbes. I was having a conversation with Dr. Adil Khan, and we were talking about regenerative medicine and stem cell therapies. And I had mentioned I think I was talking about the metabolic implications of cancers. And he mentioned, and this may or may not be related, so just redirect me here
Sure.
if I'm incorrect, but he was talking about spores, fungal spores, being sort of an emerging theory around, and it's not all cancers, but certainly maybe a sub cohort of cancers. And I had never heard of that before. And he was saying, yeah, that's why sometimes, you might go into the sauna and you don't sweat. So like one of the, when you're thinking about, people who go to the gym and, they're not sweating, or they're going into it prevents you from, at least my very basic understanding, so you can certainly expand on this.
Sure.
The way that he was explaining it was that this type of maybe invasion, if you're someone who goes in the sauna and never sweats, what's happening is the spores are preventing that detoxification from that through the skin, through the skin glands. Is that right? Is that incorrect? Is there more nuance? I'm sure that
There's always a lot
detail,
more nuance. Yeah. So a lot of this stems from the quality of a person's environment too. And I think what he's specifically referring to is, specifically fungal toxins or anaphytoxins that can
Right.
exist in, I don't know if it's anaphytoxins. Sorry. I think it's anaphytoxins. But basically, if your environment is pretty poor, the likelihood of you interacting with those toxins is not going to be super high. So I think most people don't have to worry about fungal spores in their environment and their relation to cancers. Of course, there's things like asbestos. If you live in a specific environment and you have frequent exposure to asbestos, that's going to increase the likelihood for specific types of cancers like lung cancers of the
Right.
intestinal mucosa and those sorts of things, or gastrointestinal mucosa.
Hmm.
But like I said, there's a lot of nuance there, and I think that might be what he's referring to. But there's a variety of other different microbes that are more likely to promote cancers. So, a good example or a better example of that would be like HBV, which is a virus associated with liver cancer or hepatocellular carcinoma specifically, or HPV associated with uterine cancers. So, these viruses can, over time, based on our exposure, cause genetic mutations that, or mess with specific proteins that can cause genetic mutations that increase a person's likelihood for cancers. Now, just because somebody does have this virus or something doesn't mean they're going to get cancers. There's much more in our environment and depending on the things that we do that can reduce our risk for cancer. So even if somebody is infected with that specific virus, it doesn't mean they're always going to get cancer.
Right. And there's a couple of areas that I wanted to explore, the genetic predisposition that some of us may have towards certain cancers, based on certain SNP, mutations,
Sure.
the metabolic underpinnings of cancer, maybe how those two fit together. Before we get into that though, I did want to ask, and just in my prep for this conversation, and this is probably going to sound like a really dumb question, but I'm going to
No
ask
such
it
thing.
anyway, is what is the point of cancer? Like, I don't, when we think about at the end of the game, if it's going to kill its host, what is the net benefit? Like, I was sort of reading, the hallmarks of cancer and different types of cancer and like different, and this one question just sort of kept coming up over and over again. Like, is there an evolutionary or teleologic reason that I'm missing? Like, why does this exist?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a really tough question to answer because it also implies like a sense of blame in why certain people get, cancers, but there is no evolutionary advantage to having cancers from a human perspective. Now you could think about it in terms of like population control, but even then, just because there are so many people on the planet, I still wouldn't say that there's like some sort of evolutionary advantage to having cancer, even
Right.
from a population control perspective. So realistically, I don't know all the reasons why cancer exists. I mean, there are a variety of different reasons. Like, it's typically associated with being a disease of aging. So as people get older, they have greater
Right.
likelihoods for developing a variety of different cancers. But there are some species of animals and various plants that don't get cancers because of not only genetic differences but also environmental differences associated with their biology. So a good example of that I often like to discuss is elephants. Elephants have very, very low frequencies of cancers within their population, and that's specifically because they have multiple copies of this protein called P53. And so basically it reduces their likelihoods of developing cancers in the first place. But humans, we only have two. So, if one of those is mutated, and they sometimes are in a lot of genetic cases, that'll significantly increase the likelihood of a human to get cancer. And there are a variety of other different contexts associated with different species, bivalves, clams, those sorts of things. They don't typically develop cancers. There's species of whales. So there's maybe something to be said there about aquatic dwelling animals.
Right.
But it is a discussion surrounding evolution and I guess why cancer is so prominent amongst humanity. And I think realistically a lot of that is because of certain behaviors that come with humanity. Now this isn't to say that it's anyone's fault, because there's realistically only so much that someone can do in the environment that they grow up on, based on their
Sure.
socioeconomic status and all those things. But
Yeah.
and that's why
If you grow
I
up in Flint, Michigan, where you have, that's going to be, you're going to have a different outcome let's say, with the environment that your genes are living in, than somewhere that has clean water,
Yeah,
for
if you
example.
grow up in a
Yeah.
third world country versus a first world country,
Right.
it's
Right.
a privilege in a way. So there is some evolutionary component associated with it, but the degree of which we don't really know all the details there. It's really complicated, as you'd expect.
Yeah, and I think about, some cancers, if you catch them early, there's, the survivability rate of them is quite high. But even, things like I had a colleague who had, was it thyroid? I think she had thyroid, like she just, after she had the baby, just her neck, like she almost looked like she had a goiter, thyroid cancer, but very high survivability. And then you
Yeah,
have
I had a friend that
others.
also had thyroid cancer.
Yeah, like very high survival rate. My boys, their cousin, young. She's very young, but she had, oh my gosh, is it lymphoma?
Okay,
She had ALL, I think. So
acute
she had
lymphocytic
like
leukemia. Yeah, leukemia.
yeah, leukemia. Pardon me, leukemia. She had ALL,
Hmm.
and she's fine. She was 4 or 5. Age of diagnosis, and she's running around playing with her cousins,
That's
like
great. I'm
nothing
glad she's doing
happening.
well.
Yeah. So you have cancers like that where the survivability is quite high. And then you have these silent killers, maybe something like a pancreatic
Yeah,
cancer, where you typically don't even see any changes until there's been some type of metastasis and there's not much that we can do. So and there's no answer. I guess there's no answer at this point, but my mind goes to like, what is the point of it? Like, what is and I hear you on the, there can be a potential for misinterpreting this as blame, like, oh, you had too much sugar, or oh,
yeah,
you had too much protein, or you had too much fats, or we'll get into that, we'll get into
sure.
all of that. But my mind wonders in terms of like, how did this evolve over time to be something that, if the goal is to have this replicable immortality, and to direct blood and nutrients, this inducing this angiogenesis and all these different things. What's the end point if it ends up killing the host, because the cancer dies too, right?
Yeah,
So
so the point of that though is like, since we know all of these things, why can't we just stop it? Right? I think a lot of people think that way too, and it definitely oversimplifies the argument. Just because we
yeah,
know
yeah,
all these things, it often depends on when you detect the specific cancers. And as you point out,
right,
depending on
yeah,
when you detect it and where the cancer originates, it's going to
hmm,
dramatically complicate treatment options too. So, just because we know all these things about how certain cancers grow and develop, once they start, it's kind of like a domino effect of events that it's very, very challenging to treat in a lot of specific contexts. Obviously, some cancers are more treatable than others, and some we've been studying for a long time because they've
yeah,
been more prevalent in society, things like ALL and various leukemias and those sorts of things. And there are
hmm,
specific reasons to why those are more prominent in society than maybe some other cancers. But yeah, it's really challenging, and you'll probably hear me say that a million times throughout this episode.
yeah. And I appreciate it because, as I was saying to you before we got started, sometimes you hear people, well-respected scientists, for example, who sound so confident
Yeah.
about the origins of cancer, or the origins of, or this is absolutely the right diet that you should follow,
Mhm.
and kind of misses the bioindividuality and sort of like I started off at I hope I said this while we were recording, but cancer is just like saying human. It's almost a meaningless term because we have all these different types of variants, all these different types of presentations.
Mhm.
So, okay, let's talk a little bit about some of the genetic determinants. And if we can start with breast cancer, I think that's Angelina Jolie sort of famously went through a double mastectomy. I think she also might have had a hysterectomy as well. She was positive, or she had the BRCA
Mhm.
gene, and that's sort of the maybe more well-known genetic mutation. But even when we look at genetic mutations, we know, well, at least with the BRCA1, 60% of people will go on to develop some type of breast cancer,
Sure.
but there's 40% that won't, right? So it's kind of what you were saying, like just because you have the genetic SNP, or because you have the genetic the mutation, doesn't necessarily guarantee your destiny. So I thought we might start a little bit with breast cancer, if you wanted to expand on that a
Yeah,
little
I
bit.
will provide a little bit of a disclaimer. I've only studied breast cancer for a relatively small period of time, so there's only a certain amount of depth that I can realistically get into in terms of
Okay.
talking about this, but I know enough about some mutations that I think can help people better understand the etiology of the disease itself. Because I think it's also important to recognize that every cancer is different, and it's unrealistic to expect that I would know everything about every type of cancer.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fair. That's fair. And so some of the questions I was polling my audience before we got on this conversation,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people were asking about hormone replacement therapy and breast cancer risk.
Mm-hmm.
And we can, I don't know if you'd like to comment on that, but there's a lot of, I mean, I think some of that comes from the Women's Health Initiative, which we don't necessarily have to go into
Sure.
now, but the population that they selected, the mortality risk of, they were smokers, they were overweight, they were like
Yeah.
10 years past menopause. And what I think still persists is when we are taking hormone therapy,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to increase potentially, and there may be a risk here that it increase, these hormone receptor or these hormone based cancers in breasts.
Yeah.
I don't know if you wanted to talk or expand on
Sure.
that a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that actually there's a lot of overlap between breast cancers and ovarian cancers. And I spent my thesis, my PhD thesis work was surrounding ovarian cancer. And so there is a lot of overlap there regarding, how specific hormones like estrogen can be associated to making cancers of the breast and the ovary worse. And a lot of that relies on the breast tissue because they're very important. Specifically, estrogen is very important in regulating the metabolism and basically cell biology of how breast and ovarian tissue form and how they
Right.
maintain themselves over time as people get older, especially in women. Obviously, estrogen is also important for males, but, obviously more important in females from a variety of different biological perspectives or physiological perspectives. But just to bring people back onto the biology of how estrogen can worsen cancers over time, if people have a genetic predisposition like a BRCA mutation, and maybe they're not paying attention to their diet, they're eating a lot of, hyperpalatable foods, usually ultra-processed foods, it can kind of worsen the metabolism associated with estrogen production because estrogen is initially produced from cholesterol. And so if we consume exogenous cholesterol in excess, via, obviously caloric intake, it can worsen some of the characteristics of disease. And so if people are more conscientious of their diet or even things like exercise and sleep, they can reduce the risks even if they have something like a BRCA mutation or a variety of other mutations that can occur even in breast and ovarian cancers. The same is true for P53. I mentioned that already. It's pretty common in not only breast cancer, but I think like 50% of all cancers, there will be some form of P53 mutation. And those mutations do vary. They don't all do the same thing. Like there's, going back to P53, there's like gain of function. So you can mutate the function of the protein to gain something that it didn't have before. There's also loss of function mutations. So where you completely reduce the ability of P53 to regulate genetic repair processes that it normally does. So just because something is mutated doesn't mean that the mutation is the same across people too, which further complicates things. So yeah, that just kind of brings some of the biology back to breast cancer and ovarian cancer. And one thing I typically like to teach, sorry to continue rambling.
Right.
One thing I typically like to teach is the two-hit hypothesis by Alfred Knudsen. So he essentially, and you can look this up, it's called the two-hit hypothesis. And this kind of simplifies why if we have a genetic mutation of a specific gene, it requires more than that event to induce cancer formation. So if I have a BRCA gene mutation or some other gene mutation that's prevalent through a variety of different cancers, that mutation alone isn't sufficient to induce tumor formation. It might be a start or like the start of the dominoes falling, the domino effect, so to speak. But there needs to be another either genetic event or environmental event that is alongside that event to induce cancer formation. So that's why I try and focus.
Necessary but not sufficient.
Yeah, that's why I try and focus on the behavioral things that people can do to reduce risks. Because if you have a genetic mutation, you can't ethically change that. You can't genetically engineer that out of people without affecting the evolution of the human race, which is, an ethical consideration and artificial selection and whatnot. But yeah, that's where it becomes a bit problematic.
Yeah, and maybe you can speak to this with ovarian cancer as well.
Mm-hmm.
One of the arguments, specifically with HRT and its risk in upregulating or chunking up, let's say, risk for breast cancer, or the argument against it is that if estrogen was the big problem, that we should see theoretically more breast cancer in younger women where the levels of estradiol or the levels of estrogen are higher, because typically what happens as we age is we have this wane, and certainly through perimenopause and then the menopausal transition, we see estrogen levels plummet in perimenopause, but in menopause, it's like down to 1% of those previous numbers, right? So if
Sure.
you are a fertile cycling woman, maybe somewhere between you're going to average somewhere between 100 to 250 picograms per mil, over the course of, the month, it's going to change. But then when we're in menopause, it's like 1% of that. So I think that there's been people who've pushed back on the estrogen or the HRT specifically. I think it's like the hormone replacement driving up breast cancer risk. Do we know is that a known when we are thinking about HRT, because this is a big, global conversation right now, is sort of bringing back HRT and sort of looking at the WHI as this, statistically flawed. The way that they cut and slice the data, the way that they select the participants, et cetera, was subpar. Are there known risks with HRT specifically, whether it's the estrogen and progesterone if you still have a uterus, or the estrogen alone if you don't have a uterus? And are we aware of any risks with
Yeah.
HRT upregulating breast cancer risk?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's been known for quite some time that hormone replacement therapy is associated with increased breast cancer and ovarian cancer risks, because the hormones themselves can, in some cases, be causative to specific cancers. It depends on, again, the genetic differences between people, but the way that
Right.
these hormones work is to enable, again, this is probably an oversimplification, but the way that these hormones work is to enable growth processes that maintain normal cell biology. But if there's something that genetically someone has, like the BRCA mutations or maybe dysregulation of estrogen receptor signaling, it can increase their likelihoods of the things associated with estrogen receptor signaling and increase their likelihoods for specific cancers of the breast or ovary. And even then, there are subtypes within breast and ovarian cancer that HRT is more associated with. But yeah, I mean,
And is that just initially when you're starting to take the HRT? Is there, because I know that there's an increase, like we see an increased risk in cardiovascular disease. I think it's the first year, maybe two,
yeah.
of initiating HR. Is it in that sort of first little acute delta of starting the therapeutic, and then if you've been on it for 5 or 10 or 15 years, let's say, that it sort of wanes, it comes down?
So typically with these things, it's a dose dependent sort of thing. So the longer period of
Okay.
time somebody is spending on hormone replacement therapy, usually the greater their risks are for developing these sorts of things. But from a quality of life perspective, sometimes the pros outweigh the cons. So like in this case, the con would be increased cancer risks, but the pros would be like this person will have a greater quality of life if we give them this thing. And just one of those cons is greater cancer risk. So they try and give suggestions about, what people can do to reduce risks while achieving the quality of life that they can get from hormone replacement therapy. Because some people, realistically need these, like people that have PCOS
Yeah.
frequently benefit from hormone replacement therapies. And if they don't have those, the quality of life is it dramatically goes down. So yeah, they might have increased cancer risks if they're taking these things over time, but there's a variety of other things that they can do, not even through hormone replacement therapy, but through lifestyle interventions. And they're relatively basic that most people know about alongside those things to have a better lifestyle.
Sleep like a boss and lift like a beast.
Absolutely. That's the premise of my whole life, and I'm sure it is
Yeah.
yours as well. Do your best,
Yeah,
right?
you do your best. Absolutely. Okay. So let me just ask a clarifying question. So when you were saying the known risks for HRT, it's sort of dose dependent. So the longer that you're on it. So do we also see, so I mean, I think someone with a BRCA gene mutation probably is aware of that, or maybe, if they've done the genetic testing or what have you. You mentioned also disrupted R signaling as well. Is there a way for you to understand whether or not there's some estrogen receptor dysregulation through genetic testing or any other means or mechanism?
Yeah, so oftentimes if somebody is diagnosed with breast cancer or even ovarian cancer, they'll often look at the level of protein expression and mRNA expression of, progesterone receptor, Herceptin, because sometimes people possess mutations in HER2 genes.
Yeah. Yeah.
They'll look at epidermal growth factors, all these growth pathways. They'll look at estrogen receptor. Estrogen receptor itself is a nuclear receptor. So it's on the surface of the nucleus. So they'll look at the expression of those things, and it can sometimes be indicative of the responsiveness of that specific cancer type to estrogen. Of course, there's a variety of different molecular characteristics that need to be determined but it can be indicative based on just overall abundance of estrogen receptor signals that they can detect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Okay, so that's actually great because that was my next question. It's like, okay, how do we know if you or anyone listening, how do you know if you have disrupted ER signaling?
Yeah.
But there's ways that we can qualify that and quantify that, it seems
Yeah,
like.
in the clinic, typically, if someone is diagnosed with breast cancer or ovarian cancer, we can go in and perform some form of a biopsy. We can cut that tissue in a variety of different ways, do a variety of different experiments, whether it's histology, we're cutting thin sections and we're staining for specific proteins. We'll look for Herceptin, we'll look for progesterone receptor. And so one commonality between like breast cancer and ovarian cancer, you'll see, HER2 negative, HER2 positive, PR positive. And this is what's commonly, if you miss all those HER2 receptors, estrogen receptor, progesterone receptor, this is what's called triple negative breast cancer. And that's
Yeah.
typically associated with later stage breast cancer or progression. And so the outcomes associated with that, because they've downregulated those things, they've adopted new mechanisms of promoting cell survival that we need to figure out what those are so we can, instead of giving like the newer therapies that target the HER2 receptor, we can't give those if they're missing the HER2 receptor. So we have to come up with other ways to better treat those people.
I want to ask you about alcohol and breast cancer, and then the secondary question will be about ovarian cancer. I pulled this from the WHO's website. Alcohol is classified as a Group 1 human carcinogen by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the IARC. It is causally linked to causally, not correlate.
Yep. Causal.
Causally linked. Causal to 7 types of cancer. Besides female breast cancer, it increases the risk of developing oral cavity, pharynx, esophagus, liver, larynx, and colorectum, or the large intestine, and rectum cancers. There is no safe level of alcohol consumption. I'm almost done. The risk of breast cancer increases with each unit of alcohol consumed per day. More than 10% of alcohol attributable cases they're talking about in Europe, arises from drinking just 1 bottle of beer, 500 mils, or 2 small glasses of wine, 100 mils each every day.
Yes. I mean, that just kind of keeps it simple, but, alcohol is a known carcinogen. So the more we drink is going to be more associated with a variety of different the cancers that you mentioned in terms of those risks. And specifically, a lot of this comes from alcohol metabolism in the human body. So when you consume alcohol, it's a 2-step enzymatic process in the liver specifically that utilizes aldehyde dehydrogenase and alcohol dehydrogenase in the breakdown of alcohol. In the first step there, it produces a carcinogen called formaldehyde. So most people are familiar with formaldehyde. It's a preservative that is commonly used in labs like
embalming from my lab days. I'm like, I can still smell it.
I know. I can smell it if I think about it,
I can still smell it from my cadaveric dissection.
Yeah, I mean, I was initially trained as a marine biologist, so a lot of those organisms were stored in formaldehyde before we did our dissections. But yeah, so in breaking down that formaldehyde, then it's broken down by, I guess aldehyde dehydrogenase, alcohol dehydrogenase breaks down into formaldehyde, and then aldehyde dehydrogenase breaks it down even further in the liver, and then it's, excreted eventually through a variety of different products. But the rate of metabolism there very much matters. Obviously, if we drink excess amounts of alcohol, we're producing more and more formaldehyde. If it's not metabolized in an appropriate way or an efficient way, that can increase likelihoods for cancers. And actually, an example of this that I often like to give people, certain cultures are more susceptible for things like liver cancer because of polymorphisms that exist in the genes associated with alcohol dehydrogenase. So a good example of this, have you ever heard of, Chinese or Asian flush syndrome?
Yes.
Yeah, so
my neighbor can't drink alcohol because her cheeks get pink.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a super prevalent polymorphism, and a polymorphism isn't a mutation. It's just a variation in a gene that can sometimes affect how the product of that transcription of that gene and translation of that gene, because transcription, DNA to mRNA, mRNA to protein, it can change how that protein functions. And in this case, it's an enzyme in the degradation of alcohol. So Chinese people often have this polymorphism, this variant in this gene, which changes the rate of alcohol metabolism. It slows it down pretty dramatically, pretty significantly. And so they're at greater risks of developing things like liver cancers if they drink alcohol compared to somebody who doesn't have that
because the intermediates are there longer.
Exactly.
The formaldehyde
intermediates, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those people should be more receptive of the dangers of alcohol consumption. Now, this isn't to say that people can't handle alcohol. Yes, it is associated with risks. And I'm not going to act like I didn't just have a rum punch last night, you know? I enjoy alcohol just like anybody. I enjoy the occasional drink, and I do my best now to not drink excessively. You know, it comes with its risks. I'm aware of that. Just, you know, people should know that, you know, I'm flawed in my understanding of things too, but despite that, I still enjoy these things.
Well, welcome to the human race, though.
Yeah. So, I mean, but the thing is, like,
Yeah.
because I have those things that I enjoy and I know the risks associated with them, I do other things that I can potentially offset those effects. So, if you are drinking a lot of alcohol, but you lead a sedentary lifestyle and you have poor sleep habits, or, you know, you live in a pretty stressful environment where you don't go to therapy, would be a good indicator of, you know, increasing your risks for cancers. So I try and control those where I can, and I try and give people the same advice. Like, don't stop doing things that you enjoy just because they have risks associated with them. You have to live your life at the end of the day. But, you know, there's only so much you really should worry about. And I think a lot of people miss the forest for the trees on that.
Well, I feel with, I don't drink a lot of alcohol, partially because I don't really enjoy the taste. I find particularly red wine and, I have nice wine, but I
Yeah.
get headaches. I get headaches and I don't enjoy it. So I'm sort of naturally for whatever polymorph, like whatever my biology, I just don't do well with alcohol generally.
Well, that's
But it
good.
is,
Most people realistically don't do well with alcohol, but
well, true. But I don't even enjoy the process. Like I don't enjoy, and maybe this is, I don't know. So I'll just say, so when we were, growing up, so my father is Portuguese
okay.
and, they would make their own house wine. They
Yeah.
would just go and make it in the back. They had the barrel, they'd grow the grapes in the backyard. They do the whole thing. And so my dad would just, like, I just always have a little bit with him. Like I'd always taste it. So it was never really it was just like dad's drink, it was just like whatever. I just always have a sip of it. And it was never a big thing. So when I, became of age, like 16, 18, whatever, I didn't care for it. But like friends who had been told, the alcohol, like, they had been said, it's bad, it's bad. And then finally, they're able to party would be totally shit faced,
Yeah.
pardon my French.
It's all good.
And then they would, and they were sort of just on it. They loved how it made them feel. It made them
Yeah.
feel free. It made them feel, like they had no inhibitions. They could be themselves, etc. And I never felt that because it was just always part of the family dinner. It was,
Yeah.
Every Sunday, that kind of thing. And it was just like, I don't really get this
Yeah,
culture
I think
at
there's
all.
something to be said about desensitization to those things at a relatively young age. I think you'd see the same trends in Italian cultures. So I grew up in
Yeah.
an Italian background. So
Yeah.
while I don't desire those things, I will enjoy them on occasion. So it's not like I drink them
Yeah.
every day. And obviously the Portuguese are known for making a good port. Actually, and I have a pretty good port in my alcohol cabinet too. So I enjoy that sometimes. But I think there's something to be said about the frequency that people drink these things. And you can enjoy these things if obviously you don't, but there are other people out there that enjoy drinking these things and maybe even like getting shit faced. But they should really be trying to not do that and try and really reduce the amount of alcohol they consume just to where they can enjoy it, but not really, have increased risks associated with the dose. Something you may have seen on my channel is the dose of something makes the poison. So yes, it inherently is a carcinogen, but obviously the more you drink of it, the more toxic it'll be. And the same could be said about cigarette smoking and tobacco smoke. And I would say even despite sufficient evidence, marijuana smoke as well.
Right. Well, the question, so you can either, look at me and say, oh, she's like so boring, and which is true. I can be boring. But there's also
Don't assume anything from me. That's not good. I'm not as
also the French
judgmental, I promise.
I appreciate that.
I used to be. I gotten better.
Yeah, as we all have,
Yeah,
right?
but-
That's my position on fasting. I've talked about that a lot.
Yeah.
Like I used to think fasting was so great, and I especially for women, and I've revised my position on that.
Well, everything
Like, significantly.
has its context, right? And I guess that's just the process of learning, right? So like, I mean, there's a bunch of things that I used to think, especially even relating to cancer, like, just as an example, I thought at one point aspartame caused cancer, but then you start to learn more about how to interpret those studies and determine the realistic nature of that and how it translates into, how society is actually consuming those things and the experiments that were performed and maybe some flaws there. You learn that there's a lot of, unrealistic considerations that are to be made there. And that's just the process of learning.
Or aggressive assumptions, maybe based on the data.
Yeah. And this is where the Dunning-Kruger effect often comes into play is, people
Right.
stop learning and they read that one thing back, when they first started learning something, and they just, dig in heels deep into the thing. And then
Yeah.
that becomes dogma, and they refuse to question their own dogma. And then they go on social media, they start their own account, they get millions of followers because they say aspartame causes cancer, they say sugar causes cancer, and they refuse to
Right.
learn anything despite the presentation of evidence.
Right. So let's talk about the metabolic implications of
Sure.
cancer, because we've been talking a little bit about some of the genetic predispositions, polymorphisms, different differences there. And I was saying to you offline before we started recording, I was listening to Dr. Thomas Seyfried, and he's been on my friend's podcast, and I've heard his name come up a bunch of times. And so I was listening to his thinking about the metabolic implications of cancer.
Sure.
And we can certainly dive into it because I found it incredibly interesting. I thought he was very confident. Like,
Sure.
wow, he's so confident. So let's talk about let's explain for the audience what the Warburg effect is.
Sure.
And then we can talk maybe about what we think is happening. Is there defunct mitochondria? Is there accelerated fermentate? Like, what is happening in the cell? And then maybe we can blend that with a conversation around dietary interventions,
Yeah.
how that may or may not improve prognosis.
Sure, absolutely. So going back to your initial question, which is what is the Warburg effect? The Warburg effect
Yeah.
is essentially, I guess I can give a little bit of a history lesson. Back in the early 1920s, Otto Warburg discovered that, and his colleagues, obviously, there's a few other scientists, alongside the Coreys, who also got a Nobel Prize, and Carl, geniuses alongside Otto.
name.
They essentially discovered that cancer cells were making a product of fermentation, which is lactic acid, despite being in the presence of oxygen. So typically in normal cell metabolism, if there's oxygen present, you won't undergo fermentation. But they were making a product of fermentation, which is lactic acid, despite the amount of oxygen present. So as a result of this, they went on to discover that cancer cells typically have, and I say typically because it's not always the case, but most cancer types typically will increase the rate of glucose intake into the cells. So they'll increase the amount of glucose receptors, and it'll increase the rate of glucose intake into the cancer cell, and that can fuel glycolysis. And now our understanding of the Warburg effect has significantly changed over time due to technological advances in our ability to understand what's called metabolic flux, or basically we can now track glucose through glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and a variety of other pathways utilizing a form of technology called mass spectrometry. If we label the carbon atoms in a glucose molecule in cancer cells, we can track where that carbon atom is going, and track it through the citric acid cycle into the electron transport chain in the mitochondria, or if it goes into other pathways via anaplerotic reactions or different reactions through the citric acid cycle or pentose phosphate pathway or gluconeogenesis, a variety of different metabolic pathways in different cancers. And so over time, Otto Warburg's initial observations that increased glucose, or cancer cells have increased glucose uptake, and this results in lactic acid formation. That's the Otto Warburg effect, essentially.
And is it also true when we're talking about, so when you said glycolysis, this is a departure from oxidative phosphorylation or oxphos if you're a cool cat.
Yeah.
Is it also true that the fermentation, so that the cell will continue to ferment, let's say, even in the presence of oxygen?
Right.
Is that right?
Yes. So that's what was weird to them, because they were making a product of fermentation in the presence of oxygen. So that's the thing that makes a cancer cell in many cases in association with the Warburg effect, because normal cells won't do that. They'll bring in glucose at a relatively normal rate, which varies,
Steady, yeah.
and it'll go
Yeah.
into the citric acid cycle at a normal rate, and it'll go into the electron transport chain at a normal rate. It's just those rates, and that's where I was talking about the flux. The rate of substrate moving through those processes matters. And actually what we've learned over time is that cancer cell metabolism is actually slow in the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. It's just very quick in glycolysis. But that's to reroute glucose to other reactions that favor a more immediate growth of cancer cells, as opposed to spending that energy to go through the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. there's other ways you can generate energy inside of the cell besides the electron transport chain to generate ATP or oxidative phosphorylation. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for that. So, what is the implication then? What is the implication, if any, for diets and specifically, and I'll bring up Dr. Seyfried again here.
Yep.
So, he is a big advocate for reducing sugar intake, carbohydrate intake. He's a big fan of the ketogenic diet.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on that because, and I'll also say that I've seen a lot of anecdotal, a lot of sort of case studies and these are all just N of one. So I'm not saying
Right.
this is high level evidence here, but, there's been a lot of people who've said, well, that really did cure my X, right? So I know that that's not necessarily considered, that shouldn't be gospel for
Right.
everybody. But what are your thoughts around utilizing I'll say this, in conjunction with traditional therapies, and we can explore traditional therapies as well. But what are your thoughts on dietary manipulation, restricting carbohydrates? Is that going to be beneficial based on our updated understanding of the Warburg effect?
Yeah, and that's literally just because as we've acquired more knowledge about how metabolism is dysregulated in a variety of different cancers, we can come to understand how dietary interventions can change how cancer cells are metabolizing specific resources, not even glucose. There have been other intermediates that, Dr. Seyfried likes to discuss often, and that's glutamine dependence in.
Yes, that was, yes,
Yeah,
yes,
so
yes.
I've even published a paper on this in my thesis as well. So we can target these anaplerotic reactions that utilize glutamine entry into the citric acid cycle. So instead of glucose, cancer cells will increase reactions that bring glutamine into the citric acid cycle for energy. And
Right.
so we have FDA approved inhibitors. Teleglenistat, I believe, is one of them that targets glutaminase 1. And I actually, in my thesis work, in collaboration with, obviously, the first author on that paper was Shui Wu, who was a great postdoc in our lab at the time. And I can send you that paper.
If you can, I'll put that in the link for
Yeah,
in the show notes. Yeah.
it's a really good paper, and essentially we showed that in a subtype of ovarian cancer called ovarian clear cell, which is what I focused my thesis on, they upregulate this enzyme called glutaminase 1. And there's different isoforms of glutaminase 1, and they're expressed differentially in different types of tissues. But this is the predominant one that's expressed in the ovary to mediate the citric acid cycle. So they upregulate that enzyme. It brings in cancers, not normal cells, it brings more glutamine into the citric acid cycle, independent of glucose concentrations. So we can target those reactions utilizing glutaminase 1 inhibitors, and we can reduce the potential of cancer cells to utilize glutamine to continue to promote their cell survival. So where diets come into play here is we can also do, I guess in this context, it would be protein restriction, which is something you typically don't want to do in cancer patients, especially later stage cancer patients.
Right. Yeah.
So we very much need to pay attention to the context. And there's, I have to say this with a strong degree of importance, because now we're studying these in clinical trials to better learn how diets can impact specific cancers. They're not going to be useful for all cancers, and it depends on where the tumor originates. So what we're studying, ketogenic diets and even fasting approaches, is in organs that have a sort of dependence on glucose metabolism. So you could imagine that would be something like the pancreas, because the pancreas, when you consume a glucose-rich meal, will secrete insulin, and insulin has its own roles in promoting tumor growth. But again, those are specific in certain tissues of origin of specific types of cancers. But that won't be as applicable to a breast tumor or ovarian tumor or splenic tumor or something like that. Different tumors don't rely on the same metabolic outputs for their continued growth. So they have to be specific types. And so we're investigating ketogenic diets and fasting approaches in pancreatic cancer models and even liver cancer models to see if those dietary regimens in combination with chemotherapeutics or traditional therapies, not even just chemotherapies, can produce favorable options as opposed to either dietary intervention alone or single treatment of a chemotherapeutic or traditional therapy alone. And so we're learning that the diets alone appear to not be very helpful, and in some cases they can make tumors worse.
And what specifically, what dietary intervention would make a tumor worse?
I would say, so from the research that I've seen, and again, there's a lot to be determined here, ketogenic diets can make certain pancreatic cancers worse alone, but the way that we're utilizing these fasting approaches and ketogenic diets is to change the metabolism. So we have to think about cancers as an adaptive disease. They don't just you don't just get cancer one day and then have these characteristics. The metabolism in cancers is very different than normal healthy cells. So they've adapted these specific mechanisms that promote their own growth. But we can utilize a diet to change that metabolism to where they'll now be sensitive to a therapy that they weren't sensitive before, because the cancer cell will respond to the dietary change its metabolism, turn on and off certain genes that may be favorable to that cancer cell. But if they turn on and off those genes, and we know about what those genes are, we can target them with drugs that wouldn't be favorable to treating that cancer prior to the diet.
Successful.
So it's like giving a new
Yeah.
window of opportunity to treat that cancer that we didn't have before if that diet wasn't available, to change that metabolic output.
Well, you just said restrict. So you said restricting protein, and this is something I wanted to talk to you because I think that there is a pervasive myth, and we'll talk about sort of some of the common myths that maybe you see. But I hear this a lot. Oh, doesn't protein cause cancer? Doesn't excess protein cause cancer? And maybe they're referring to red meat. Maybe that's it. Does protein consumption cause cancer? And then how would restricting protein? Is it what you just mentioned, where you're looking for that metabolic sort of cog switch, so that now when you apply a therapeutic like a medication, a chemotherapy, or whatever it might be, having that metabolic switch is now going to improve the efficacy of that intervention?
Yeah, so in answering the first question, no, protein doesn't cause cancer. It's more so specific amino acids that are liberated from proteins that can enable metabolic processes associated with cancer. So you can't just stop eating a protein or any protein source because it has amino acids that can be broken down that can fuel cancer cell growth. Again, this is assuming somebody has cancer. But a lot of these come from our mechanistic studies that we perform that show that when you have specific types of amino acids, particularly like branched chain amino acids, they can fuel mTOR metabolism. So you've probably heard mTOR here and there. And sometimes these are upregulated in cancers in the same way that one of the proteins that I study, which is glutaminase 1, is upregulated. So whether it's glutamine going in through glutaminase 1, or leucine or isoleucine going in through, or valine going in through processes associated with mTOR signaling, cancer cells will have different and sometimes overlapping ways. Like you can have a cancer cell that upregulates glutaminase 1 and mTOR at the same time, pulling glutamine and other amino acids to fuel cancer cell growth. But you can't, in a cancer patient, you can't just restrict that, because that's going to worsen metabolism associated with healthy cells. So yeah, sure.
Going to get muscle wasting.
Exactly. Yeah, so a common thing that we see in cancer patients is cachexia, which is what you just said, which is muscle wasting. And so if you restrict typically a later stage cancer patient of protein because you're so worried and fixated about mTOR or glutaminase 1, you're going to affect their quality of life just by impacting their healthy cells more than their cancer cells. And we've learned that even in the past year in relating to metabolic flux analyses in cancer cell metabolism, that healthy cells will be more impacted to these dietary interventions and fasting strategies than the cancer cells will. So we really, really need to be careful about the dietary strategies we're implementing in terms of better treating cancers. And that's why we've decided not to rely on diets alone. They're almost always in combination with some form of traditional therapy, because they can't be given alone, because it's going to impact healthy cell metabolism more than it would be a cancer cell. It's just, again, it's giving that window of opportunity. So no, protein doesn't cause cancer. So
that would be maybe that might be a transient intervention that you would, and then you would stop it and you start reintroducing protein, let's say, back into the diet.
Yeah. And the same could be said about, sugar restriction or glucose restriction specifically.
Right.
And so we're testing all of those things, but we don't know enough right now to confidently say that these dietary strategies will be helpful. We need to better understand the context. And that's where I think somebody like Seyfried, Dr. Seyfried, I respect his work. He does great work. He needs to calm down in terms of the confidence that he's implementing it in how he delivers this information to people, because that confidence just isn't there in terms of the research. Not yet, at least. And because he's a doctor, people will assume that he's correct. Right. And if he's a confident doctor, that can get people killed, unfortunately. So, that's why I'm very careful with the things that I say. I'm not here to be famous. I'm here to give people accurate information. And I think that, I don't know if that's his intent. Of course, I know he's trying to help people, but he really needs to be careful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like we were either talking about this offline or we've been probably dancing around it too in this conversation. I think sometimes when you present something with so much confidence, like aspartame causes cancer, I'm gonna get a lot of heat for this, but I'm probably gonna do something on seed oils because I hear so many people in the health space like seed oils are the devil. I'm like, which seeds?
Good question.
Like
Which seed
sesame
oils?
seed?
Yeah.
Like sesame seed oil?
Yeah.
Like
Grape
that
seed.
one?
Yeah.
Or
Any seeds.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, which seeds are we talking about? But they are sort of lumped together.
Right.
Like it's just like cancer,
Yeah.
seed oils, cholesterol. It's like what are we talking about? Can we be a little bit more specific?
Yeah. And so that's where the importance of
Yeah.
context really, really matters. But I find that a lot of people, unfortunately, they don't invest enough time to understanding those contexts. So they see some doctor online say something and they're like, oh, that's got to be correct. There's no research I need to do beyond this. And I don't even know how to do research to begin with. So they just trust without appropriate education.
I mean, and this is, well, I'll just mention, I think that, especially if you have an MD behind your name, there's a certain cultural authority that's associated with that.
Yeah.
And they may or may not have had the appropriate training there. I mean, this is sort of, I kind of always I jokingly say this, like I'm trained as a chiropractor, and I've sort of always been, so my love has always been like brain health, neuromusculoskeletal. Like that's my love. It's always going to be there. And, there's bad apples. There's certainly bad apples in my profession. And I think that we've always just grown up being like the outsiders, right? Because we're not really, and for most, I think it's getting better now, but I think, especially when I graduated class of 2003, we were still very much outsiders, like kind of, quacks, like called, that's like Quack Watch, I think was named after, kind of going after chiropractors and so forth. So,
a big difference who is a quack and who is not. And you're very clearly not. I think that a lot of that depends on the level of transparency somebody has, and the ability to say I don't know is a pretty strong indicator that somebody's not a quack. Yeah. So
well, thank you for that. I take that, receive that with love.
Not that you needed my validation.
No. It's always nice when a peer can recognize that. I appreciate that. So coming back to the muscle wasting so if you are someone who has a diagnosis of cancer, whether it's breast, and maybe this recommendation might change actually. So if you have maybe breast or ovarian or, pancreatic, should that patient be training? And I would love to maybe talk a little bit about myokines if we can, or if you feel comfortable talking about it. But should that person be engaging in resistance training, even if it's just as a goal to reduce the cachexia that we've been the muscle wasting that we've been talking about?
Yeah, and I'm of a pretty large group of people at this point that thinks that, if somebody is diagnosed with cancer, they should be not only given treatment from a molecular perspective, like a drug, but they should also be given assistance via registered nutrition for oncology. So there's specific registered cancers. They should also be given a cancer-specific PT. So what I mean by that is, again, the
personal trainer, physical
personal
therapist,
personal trainer, or potentially a physical therapist too. So the nutritional guidelines for a cancer patient are going to be different, especially depending on stage of cancer and those sorts of things for a cancer patient. So they need
type, as we've been talking about.
Obviously type. So they need specific guidelines, obviously founded in evidence, to be able to make better choices about dietary habits as they progress through their disease and monitoring those changes. Alongside that, there will be things that come with treatment, whether it's surgeries or specific, even chemo can, unfortunately, it's not perfect. It's targeted, but it's not perfect because it's hard to delineate the, actual targets of treatments between normal cells and cancer cells because there is some overlap. But there's some level of off-target effects or toxicity associated with pretty much every treatment, whether it's radiation. So that will often impact a patient's mobility. So this is why I say that they should work with a PT, a physical therapist, or a personal trainer, or both, hopefully, to be able to do exercises that they can consistently and safely do throughout the treatment, because the range of motion that they might be able to do will be very different than somebody who's healthy will be able to do. So working with somebody who's professional in that space would be helpful alongside a registered dietitian who works regularly with cancer patients.
And can you speak a little bit around the mechanism of action in terms of what's happening when someone is resistance training? So we know every time that the muscle contracts, we're releasing myokines, and there's I was reading up on them for our conversation, and they're just fascinating,
Yeah.
like effing
Yeah.
fascinating. Can you speak a little bit about sort of the mechanistic targets and what's happening as a muscle is contracting, whether it's concentric, eccentric, and then how we are getting what's happening? What are these myokines? What are they doing?
Sure. Now, this is a very diverse topic that we're learning more and more about over time, especially as technology develops and more labs are examining the usefulness of exercise in reducing disease outcomes, specifically in disease states. Now, in citing a specific study, there was a study done at Dana-Farber where, this is a mouse study. Again, very clear. It was a mouse study. They put these little mice on treadmills and they examined them. It was a tumor model. I think it was lung cancer. It's a form of lung cancer, I believe. I could be getting that wrong. But it was a cancer model. They put these mice on treadmills while they had cancer, and they examined the effects of essentially exercise in terms of what muscles were secreting specific myokines or cytokines that were associated with reduced tumorigenic processes or processes associated with tumor growth. And what they found was that obviously in the group that was just on treadmills, so this is just aerobic activity or aerobic exercise, they found that these mice had reduced tumorigenic processes, whether it's related to metastasis or even growth, compared to the control group that wasn't exercising. And they found that was specific. I might be killing the cytokine. It was more related to IL-13 or IL-15, one of those two. And so the specific myokine or cytokine was being secreted from muscle tissue and reducing processes associated with tumor growth associated with the immune system. And so a lot of this stems from our physiological understanding between the coupling of our lymphatic system to muscle contractions and how it helps our immune system to work. So for a lot of people that don't know this, our lymphatic system, which is a series of networks and tubes throughout our body that is strongly right next to our muscle tissue, it doesn't have a pump. So the pump of our lymphatic system, which holds our immune cells in our body, is muscle. So this is why Gabrielle Lyon talks about the importance of muscle health and promoting longevity, and why we strive so much in terms of telling people to exercise is because in order to have a healthy functioning immune system, you have to exercise to promote lymphatic fluid movement because the muscles.
Right. It's not like the cardiovascular system
Right.
where you have
They
the
don't have a
heart
heart.
sort of driving the pressure gradient. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we need muscle contractions to drive lymphatic fluid movement, get immune cells throughout the body so that they can respond to tissue damage, whether it's cancer cell processes, if you have a disease like cancer or other diseases like obesity or something like that, or diabetes, a variety of other diseases. But yeah, there's a variety of different mechanisms that are associated with lymphatic fluid movement and muscle contractions that really drive home how important exercise is in reducing disease outcomes.
And when we say exercise, we are talking specifically about resistance training. Is there a role for cardiopulmonary or cardiorespiratory, like cardio?
Yeah, I mean, so the type of exercise definitely matters, but I would say from a holistic level, what people need to get from this is just exercises that they can do for a long term. So we can do any experiment at the end of the day that shows that resistance training is better than aerobic training. But the most important thing that anybody can do regarding their training is just something that they can consistently do for as much time as possible safely. So it doesn't matter which one is better than the other. It just matters the behavioral tendency to continue moving.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Great. Yeah, makes sense. Let's talk a little bit about, we've been talking about diet in terms of ketogenic diets and caloric restriction and fasting in conjunction with other therapies. But are there when I think about diet, the way that I was actually we had some people over for dinner the other day, and I had this one couple, there's this one woman, and she was saying, I'm so confused about all the information out there, and maybe I should do carnivore, maybe I should, maybe I need to restrict that and restrict this. And I said, why don't you, I said, this is how I like to think about diet now. This is how I'm currently thinking about diet. Rather than trying to think about all the things that you should be eliminating, maybe you should be flipping that and think about all the things that you need to get from your diet in order to nourish your cells, right? So I need to have omega-3s. That's really going to be great for heart health, for brain health, for reducing inflammation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, what is a great source of omega-3s? That's going to be fatty fish, or that might be nuts and seeds, et cetera. I need to get protein from my diet. Where is my protein going to come from? I'm going to choose animal-based, et cetera, et cetera. So starting to maybe shift from what do I need to eliminate, which women are typically, that's all we're trying to eliminate our calories. We're trying to eliminate foods in order to get smaller and smaller and smaller. Maybe we can shift the paradigm to start thinking a little bit more towards what do I need to get from my diet?
Yeah, what should I be
my
eating?
diet, what should I be eating?
Yeah.
So what are some of the things that you think we should be eating on a regular basis, however, you want to define regular, in terms of things that have robust scientific evidence that that can show a reduction or reduced risk in developing certain types of cancers? And I'll throw a little. I would love for you to talk about fiber if you can.
Yeah, no, I was
fiber and coffee.
You don't need to tell me. Honestly, just eat fiber and drink coffee. That's it. No cancer.
That's it.
Nope. I'm
there
kidding.
You go.
I wish it was that simple. No, but yeah.
The only thing in my fridge is Metamucil.
Yeah.
No, I'm just joking.
Oh my God, that would be. You'd be the prime candidate for a sponsorship by Metamucil if that was the case. And you'd have some severe gastrointestinal problems. No
I
offense.
could not go out anywhere.
Yeah.
I could not go for dinner.
You would be
or
clogged.
anything.
You'd be constipated. There is such thing as too much fiber. So this is why, and again, I'm not a nutritional scientist. I follow people like, Dr. Joey Munoz, Lane Norton is another one, Dr. Lane Norton, and a variety of other nutritionists. Dr. Adrian Chavez is another good one. And my friend who's also a cancer dietitian, she is Crystal Zuniga, Dr. Crystal Zuniga. So I often refer cancer patients to her for nutritional advice. Yeah, so, again, I'm not a nutritional scientist, but what I've learned from these people is that people need to, in general, be consuming a nutrient-rich and diverse diet. And what that basically means, it's going to vary between people. But they can get, protein sources from a variety of diverse types of protein. It doesn't need to just be red meat. It can be, chicken, salmon. We need to consider our diets from a holistic perspective because we get a variety of different nutrients from different types of meat. The same way you'd get a variety of different nutrients from different types of plants, different vitamins, different minerals, those sorts of things. And you can find a variety of those, different things that promote human health and physiology processes in our body to keep us healthy in a variety of different foods. And that should just be kind of common sense. When we grow up, we learn about the food pyramid and, kind of how important that is. And there's a lot of people that kind of, shit on the food pyramid and say, oh, it's so inaccurate, but there's some truth to it. You don't have to just hyperfixate on the breads and grains portion of the food pyramid. Just focus on foods, that you can continuously eat that enable you to get the appropriate vitamins and minerals and, things like fiber that are super important that come with vegetable consumption that can help aid digestion and absorption of those nutrients in your food. And that's going to be hyper variable between people. And this is what makes our jobs as biologists and experimental biologists specifically very, very complicated because of that variability. So, I can sit here and say, fiber consumption is super important because the literature shows that not only does reduced risk or risk reduction go down the more fiber people consume, and even it helps treatment options in terms of better enabling immunotherapies to work in cancer cases. There's only going to be a certain amount of people that will benefit from a certain amount of fiber and different types of fiber as well, whether it's psyllium husk or inulin, fermentable fiber sources versus soluble fiber sources, and there's a variety there. So I try not to hyperfixate on those details. There is a lot that the research can tell us. But, again, I just try and tell people, kind of figure out what your body is telling you to do in terms of what you should be eating and the types of fiber sources you can consume, obviously, because it's associated with reduced risks for not even just cancer, but, types of protein sources, types of vegetables, types of fruits even. Doesn't need to be any more complicated than that, I think.
Is there a relationship between fiber consumption and colorectal cancer?
Mm-hmm.
An inverse relationship?
There is an inverse relationship so basically the more fiber people consume, the reduced risks for things like colorectal cancers.
Just in prep for this show, I read that colorectal cancer is the third in the United States anyway, is the third most common cancer in the States.
Yeah.
And I think with with colonoscopies and I think with screening and with fiber consumption, I don't believe that it should be. That was just my only comment is I don't believe it should be. If we consume more fiber and you're, having, engaging in maybe the appropriate screening for polyps and whatnot, I think it shouldn't even be on the map.
Absolutely. And I think kind of an exacerbated characteristic associated with this is people who have HNPCC or Lynch syndrome, which I think we spoke about briefly offline. They have,
Yeah.
about a 50 to 60%, if not more sometimes, chance of developing colorectal cancers from a specific genetic mutation. We won't get into the details of that now, but the best advice you can give a Lynch syndrome patient or an HNPCC patient is to consume more fiber because it'll basically help not only regulate lipids in their body in terms of lipid metabolism, but it'll also help promote a healthy gut microbiome. And so because of, like the hallmarks of cancer, polymorphic microbes within the gut can
Mm.
be associated with specific inflammatory processes that are related or correlated to cancer processes. So not all inflammation is bad, but there are certain characteristics of HNPCC that if they consume more fiber, it can reduce those inflammatory characteristics that are associated with their cancers. And so we're seeing that in healthy people, that fiber consumption can, in the same context, obviously in a non-disease state, can promote a healthy microbiome in terms of helping them to digest and get certain nutrients out of their foods. And, just in general, reducing some of the bad inflammatory outcomes that can come with poor digestion. There's a very fine balance between good microbial gut health and poor microbial gut health. And a lot of it comes with like changing specific bacterial species within the gut and even fungal species that, all work in some form of symbiosis to help us digest food. And we're finding that even treatments, chemotherapies, and antibiotics can disrupt that in what's called gut dysbiosis. And so we're learning what sort of populations we need to cultivate in our gut to be able to promote not only healthy outcomes in healthy people, but also change the course of a disease.
Right. Talk to me about coffee.
Coffee.
Tell me why I'm going to live forever because I have coffee.
Yeah, so this is correlative. So there's a correlation between coffee consumption and reduced risks for cancers. And I think I made a reel about this a few weeks ago, maybe over a month ago. It's hard for me to tell time here, but yeah, there's a correlation between those who consume more coffee and reduced risks for a variety of cancers. A lot of it points to, things like polyphenols or antioxidants within coffee.
And it's liver cancers, endometrial cancer. Like, what are there certain cancers that we see that reduction in risk for, or is it across the board all cancers are reduced when we're consuming more?
Not all cancers. So things like liver cancers and gastrointestinal cancers. Yes.
Because I find every couple of years coffee is demonized. It's like it's good for you. No, it's bad for you. No, it's good for you. No, it's bad for you. And I'm like, I'm just going to be camp good for you forever.
Yeah.
Like I'm never, yeah.
Well, like we previously mentioned, this is the camp of people that, refuse to continue learning about things and where certain things can be harmful. Now, I'm not sitting here saying you should be drinking gallons of coffee a day. If you drink gallons of coffee a day, you're going to have other problems. It's not specifically the coffee. It's the dose makes the poison. I could scream that every day. And for some reason from the rooftops, no matter how often I scream it, people will sit there and just ignore me, and they'll just be like, oh, coffee causes cancer, coffee does X, or seed oils do X. But instead of going on a tangent there, we do see correlations between, people who generally drink more coffee and reduce risk for cancers. And again, this isn't to say that you should be chugging gallons of coffee a day. But, there are a lot of behaviors associated with that too. For me personally, and somewhat anecdotally, when I drink coffee, it tends to calm me down a little bit, despite there being caffeine in it. And that probably could be related to ADHD that I have. Caffeine makes me feel like a normal person. I've actually probably had like 500 milligrams today, if you couldn't tell. And I feel normal. So.
And what is it like when you don't have coffee? Is it just everything is like squirrel? Like everything is new and shiny?
No, if I don't have caffeine on a regular basis, I feel like a robot, like I'm dead inside almost. Caffeine, it gives people energy, but it just makes me feel like how I think everybody else feels. Like there are processes inside my brain that if I don't have caffeine, they're just like very, very down-tuned. Right. And so when I drink caffeine or caffeinated substance, it's like my brain is more able to deal with what I'm going through on a regular basis. I try obviously not to overdo it, but I was going back to, there are behaviors associated with coffee consumption that in my case and many other people's cases, it can reduce the likelihood of engaging in potentially poor behaviors associated with disease risk. So, clarity of mind is certainly is one thing that comes to mind.
Sure. And the polyphenols, we can also extend that
Antioxidants,
to,
right?
yeah, like all the antioxidants and the dark berries and
Yeah.
the all of that as well. So those are all great foods to be consuming on a regular
Yeah.
basis.
And on the inverse of that, you could sit here and say, oh, red wine has some of the same polyphenols that you could find
Right.
in coffee. And
Yes.
there are people that make the argument, oh, I should drink wine every day because of the resveratrol in it. Maybe,
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of people would make that argument. But obviously, there's
Yeah.
the correlation between alcohol consumption and resveratrol and the dose of either
And the
or.
amount of alcohol you would need to consume for a clinically relevant dose of resveratrol, you would be drunk off your ass
Yeah.
and you would have liver cirrhosis.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the same could be said about drinking excess amounts of coffee. Not liver cirrhosis per se, but desensitization to caffeine, and it is a diuretic, so probably poor digestive health too. Yeah.
What are some of the common cancer myths that you so we talked about a few of them. We talked about protein. What are some of the common ones that you are still trying to educate the public on that continuously come up for you?
Yeah, so other than the sugar causes cancer thing,
Oh, sugar. Yeah, that's the other one. Sugar, microwaves,
microwaves,
maybe.
yeah,
Deodorant. I had someone comment on that. Like, does deodorant cause cancer? What are some other things that you see?
other than deodorant, sugar, microwaves, there's also this strong notion that we all have cancer all the time. And that one really
Oh, that was
really
something I wanted to
pisses
ask
me
you
off.
about. That we're always making cancer.
And so that one pisses
Okay.
me off because it's literally the inability of people to learn about the difference between what makes a healthy person and what makes a sick person. And I've heard experts say this. I've heard Peter Attia say this on Andrew Huberman's podcast. And so it's upsetting to me to hear experts say that, because anybody who's ever studied any sort of healthy person physiology knows that cancer is not the same thing as a healthy state. And so there are very specific differences that makes a cancer cell that aren't in a healthy cell. And I think a lot of the blame here comes from imperfections in normal cell biology. So I was recently on Jordan Shallow's podcast, The Muscle
Oh,
Doc.
Jordan, I love
Yeah,
him.
Jordan's such a
Yeah.
good dude. And
He's fellow DC, and he's been on the show.
yeah,
Love him.
yeah, we discussed this as well. In normal biology, we learned that there are error rates associated with the repair of specific processes. In other words, the enzymes involved within repairing DNA, there's an error rate associated with those processes. And if they do make an error, there are checkpoints, things that can come
Right.
in and take care of, those processes that if things continually go wrong, those cells will be committed to death. Now, it's not shocking to see that some of those pathways are often, dysregulated in cancers too. But because of those error rates in normal healthy cell biology that, make normal healthy cells function, people assume that that's our body fighting off cancer all the time. But that's just normal cell biology and normal error rates associated with normal cell biology. That's a very different state, because that's a very different state than cancer. So when you develop cancer, it's the inability to regulate those processes anymore. The error rate becomes even
checkpoints are no
greater,
longer there.
or they're
Yeah.
they're there, but they're either dysregulated or in some case upregulated in some cases. So the state between cancer and healthy is very, very different. And so that's why when people say we all have cancer all the time, it's this chronic misunderstanding of normal cell biology, because there is an error rate associated with normal cell biology. And a lot of that actually stimulates evolution. So I told you previously, I initially started my career as a marine biologist, and a lot of that
Yeah.
training that I had to take evolution courses. And so this imperfection associated with error rates in normal cell biology promotes some helpful processes in terms of our biology. We wouldn't evolve as a human race if everything was perfect.
Natural selection.
Yeah, if everything was
right.
perfect, there would be no need to evolve. We wouldn't be able to adapt to environmental demands. And so that's also the case between normal and cancer cell biology. And also, people assume that cancer cells have a perfect metabolism, that they adapt to these things, and that they're favoring their own survival. And this is where we spoke about the evolutionary component of cancer.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
the processes in cancer, like talking about angiogenesis as an example, one of the hallmarks of cancer. Cancer cells will recruit blood vessels to grow towards the tumor in an attempt to bring oxygen into the cancer to fuel hypoxic cores, areas of the tumor that don't have any oxygen, because oxygen is necessary for the cancer to continue to maintain its growth. Oxidative phosphorylation. But they don't necessarily need it. But the process of recruiting those blood vessels is imperfect. In getting those blood vessels to grow towards the tumor, it's very imperfect. They make leaky blood vessels. They're not diffusing oxygen appropriately. And so they can't still get oxygen to those hypoxic cores of the tumor. And so there's a lot of overturn between the cancer cells in hypoxic environments and healthy parts of the tumor. And they both have different metabolisms. So a solid tumor isn't just one type of cell. It's a bunch of different types of cells with different adaptations depending on where they are in a tumor. And those imperfect conditions of making blood vessels are very different from normal angiogenesis. Angiogenesis normally is a very tightly regulated process that relies on proper diffusion of oxygen to get through tissues. But that's not what happens in a cancer cell, right? So those processes are very different in a disease state versus a normal healthy state. And I think people need to understand that. So we don't all have cancer.
Well, I think that in some ways that's I mean, it can be comforting maybe for someone who is trying to understand cancer and maybe how to best mitigate their risk. It's like, oh, I don't have cancer all the time.
No.
That's great. Yeah.
That would be evolutionarily unfavorable. If you had cancer all the time, the human race would cease to exist.
Right. Joe, this has been amazing. Just looking at the time, we are right up at just bumping up against the 90-minute mark. I think that this is going to be so valuable for my audience in terms of understanding mechanisms, origins, how is distinct, cancer biology versus normal cell biology. And I think that you've put in a lot of color and even a lot of actionable items. Like we said, we're going to make a t-shirt that's like sleep like a boss, lift like a beast.
We should, honestly.
Drink your
Drink your coffee.
Drink your coffee and stack up on Metamucil.
Oh my God. That's a perfect idea.
It's right. I think so. I think we might have a program here. Is there any, if you want to direct people to your work, if people want to learn more about you, I know you have a fabulous Instagram, which we'll absolutely include, but any other ways that people can interact with you, please let them know now.
Sure. Mostly it's on Instagram because I don't have much time to do other things, but I do have a Patreon if people are able to dedicate to the cause, so to speak, because I do all this for free and I can send you the link for that. So if they want to, it's cool. But if not, I'm still going to be here giving free shit anyways.
Okay, great. So I'll have all that in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time today. And yeah, this is great.